In May 2024, when Joe Biden was still president, when Donald Trump was still buried under criminal charges, and when most of the media class was still saying there would be no war with Iran, I made three predictions. I said Trump would return. I said the United States would go to war with Iran. And I said America would lose that war in a way that permanently changes the global order. The first two already happened. So now the only question that matters is whether the third was a prediction or a diagnosis. My answer is that it was a diagnosis because what I was looking at was never a single headline, never a single election, never a single military move. I was looking at structure. I was looking at incentives. I was looking at the old patterns that empires keep repeating when they are still strong enough to punish, but no longer strong enough to turn punishment into a stable political outcome. That is the real story here. The United States is on course to lose this war, not because it cannot bomb Iran. It is on course to lose because bombing Iran is the one thing it can still do most easily. And bombing is no longer enough to produce the kind of victory Washington actually needs. That distinction is everything. If you understand it, the ending stops looking mysterious. It starts looking inevitable. The method is simple. I start with structure, then I look at incentives, then I ask what history has done. Again and again, when states with those incentives collide inside those structures. That is predictive history, not prophecy, not intuition, not ideology dressed up as confidence, structure, incentives, historical pattern. So let us walk through the structure of this war as it really is. Start with America. Washington says this war is about stopping Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. It says it is about peace, stability, deterrence, and security. That is the public language. The deeper language is different. America needs to preserve control over the global oil system because control over the oil system still supports the petrodollar, and the petrodollar still supports American financial primacy. Since the 1970s, oil being priced and traded in dollars has created permanent global demand for the American currency. That demand is one of the hidden foundations of American empire. It helps Washington finance deficits, sustain military reach, and project power far beyond what a normal state could do for so long. So if you strip away the speeches, America's real interest becomes very clear: control the energy arteries, protect the petrodollar, protect the empire built on top of both. Now look at Iran. Iran says it wants the blockade lifted, its frozen funds released, its sovereignty respected, and a settlement that does not humiliate it. All of that is true, but it is still not deep enough. Iran's first goal is survival. That is the bottom line for decades. The United States has tried to isolate, squeeze, weaken the world, transform Iran. Iraq get broken. It watched Libya get destroyed. It watched Syria get torn apart. It understands a lesson that many outsiders still refuse to absorb. If it does not resist, it does not get peace. It gets dismantled. So survival comes first, but survival is not enough. Iran also wants to transform survival into status. It wants to emerge from this era not just alive, but recognized as a durable regional power. It wants sanctions broken permanently. It wants the Strait of Hormuz not simply as a temporary wartime lever, but as a long-term source of strategic relevance. It wants its allies protected, not traded away as bargaining chips. And then there is Israel. Israel says it wants security. It says it wants Iran contained, weakened, or neutralized. That is true. But again, it is not deep enough. Israel wants to prove that it can be the most disciplined, technologically advanced, politically cohesive actor in the region. It is not just fighting for security. It is auditioning for a larger role in a Middle East where American stamina is no longer unlimited. It wants the strategic and financial elite of the wider system to look at it and think that when the old empire weakens, this is the actor that can still impose order. Then there are the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait. They do not want to be crushed between stronger powers. They want export continuity. They want regime survival. They want to stand near whoever proves strongest. Once the shape of the ending becomes visible, those are the players now ask what the structure allows. And the first structural fact is this: America can dominate the air war. That part is obvious. The United States still possesses overwhelming air superiority, deep surveillance capacity, and a strike architecture that can punish Iran far more quickly than Iran can punish America in conventional terms. It can destroy above ground targets, hit infrastructure, target leadership, damage missile sites, and keep tightening the pressure from the air. But that does not mean it can win the war. This is one of the oldest truths in modern military history. Air power can punish, it can degrade, it can terrify, it can buy time. What it consistently struggles to do is produce durable political transformation by itself. North Vietnam did not surrender because it was bombed. Germany did not surrender because bombing alone broke its will. A large, prepared, determined country does not simply dissolve because another state dominates the skies. That leads to the second structural fact. America cannot achieve a clean political victory in Iran without ground power, and a real ground war in Iran would be catastrophic. Iran is not Iraq. It is a country of roughly 90 million people with difficult terrain, long-prepared underground systems, distributed missile networks, hardened sites, and a state that has spent decades expecting the possibility of a larger war. You do not invade a country like that and get a quick outcome. You get a long war, a dirty war, and a war whose political costs accumulate faster than its strategic gains. That is why my first direct prediction remains unchanged. There will be no full-scale American ground invasion of Iran. Marines can move, warships can posture, plans can be written, bets can be made, but an actual invasion would mean casualties, money, and time on a scale the American political system does not want to bear. It would threaten Trump's presidency, destabilize the domestic political landscape, and force a degree of commitment that Washington no longer knows how to sustain. The third structural fact is the cost exchange. Iran does not need to match American spending. It only needs to keep generating pain more cheaply than Washington can suppress it. Drones, missile swarms, decentralized production, dispersed launch systems. The American answer to those systems is vastly more expensive than the systems themselves. A stronger power can survive a bad exchange ratio for a short war. It cannot build a whole strategy on one. The fourth structural fact is economic. Hormuz carries an enormous share of the world. As oil Red Sea disruption compounds the stress. When those arteries are destabilized at the same time, the war stops being merely regional and becomes global. Oil rises, shipping costs rise, fertilizer rises, food prices rise, inflation rises, political pressure rises. And that matters because America's key weakness in this war is not military hardware. It is political pain tolerance. The United States can absorb military expenditure more easily than it can absorb a furious public asking why fuel is higher, why groceries cost more, why markets are unstable, and why the war still has no clean victory story. Iran understands this perfectly well. That is not a side note. It is the logic of Tehran's strategy. Iran does not need to defeat the United States militarily in the conventional sense. It needs to keep the war expensive enough, ambiguous enough, and politically irritating enough that Washington starts searching for a face. Saving exit before Tehran's own system collapses. That is how weaker powers fight stronger empires, not by overpowering them, by outlasting their political patience. Now, if that were the whole story, Iran would still be in terrible shape because American pressure is real, the damage is real, the pain is real. So the crucial question becomes this. If Iran is under such pressure, why has it not already buckled? Why can it still choose? Why can it still reopen Hormuz in one form, tighten it in another, and speak as if it retains agency? The answer is China, but not China in the theatrical sense. Not China as a loud wartime ally issuing dramatic speeches, China as endurance architecture, China as a quiet decade of preparation. That is what too many people still fail to see. The most important thing Beijing did was not announce a grand alliance with Tehran. It built ladders under Iran's floorboards. The first ladder was financial. When Trump walked away from the nuclear deal and restored maximum pressure in 2018, China made a decision that Washington never treated with the seriousness it deserved. Beijing decided Iran would not be left completely inside an American-designed financial trap. So China bought Iranian oil in yuan rather than dollars. That mattered because sanctions do not merely punish, they isolate. They try to force countries into channels the United States can see, block, and weaponize. The moment China created a parallel payment path, Iran was no longer fully trapped inside that system. Sanctions did not become meaningless. They became incomplete. The second ladder was logistical. Shadow tankers blurred ownership, ship-to-ship transfers, relabeled crude, independent refineries willing to process politically dirty barrels because the margin justified the risk. The purpose of that system was not elegance. It was oxygen, enough oil moving, enough money arriving, enough room left in the system that Tehran could hurt without suffocating. The third ladder was time. China bought time. It accumulated reserves. It stored discounted barrels while others assumed the future would remain calm. So when Hormuz became a battlefield and the outside world panicked over energy scarcity, Beijing was not improvising. It had already prepared. That matters enormously. An energy shock only works as coercive pressure if the actors most capable of cushioning Iran's fall are also panicking. China was not panicking. It had already turned cheap barrels into strategic time. The fourth ladder was support below the threshold of open war, not necessarily in the cinematic sense that television prefers, but in the form that matters more: diplomatic shielding, sanctions, resistance, information tolerance, the broader capacity to ensure that maximum pressure did not become maximum isolation. That is what China really supplied, not immunity endurance. And endurance is enough to change the war. Because once pressure fails to produce collapse, bargaining changes. Washington is no longer facing a state that must accept terms immediately or die. It is facing a state that is hurt, damaged, strained, but still capable of choosing when to negotiate, when to tighten, when to concede a little, when to refuse, and when to wait. That difference is the whole war. Too many American arguments still confuse pain with collapse. Iran is in pain, but Iran has not collapsed. And now it leads directly to the only question that matters. Now, how does this end? I think there are three real paths. The first is the thin deal path. In this scenario, economic pain rises, diplomatic channels remain open, and Iran accepts a narrower framework before the current ceasefire window closes. Frozen assets become part of the hinge. A number is found, a formula is found. America says force worked. Iran says sovereignty was preserved. The headlines call it de-escalation. The deeper truth is that the war is frozen, not solved. This path is real. In fact, it is what many mediators want. But even in this path, the crucial point remains. Iran does not simply surrender Hormuz. At most, it accepts a form of managed passage that preserves a role in how the corridor is used, routed, or politically interpreted. Washington calls that restored navigation. Tehran calls that managed authority. Both sides describe the same arrangement with different language. The second path is the breakdown path. Talks fail, the ceasefire collapses, bombing resumes, but the second round is not the first round repeated. The first round damaged the system. It also taught every side what still survived. Networks are patched. Infrastructure is rerouted. Underground capacity becomes even more valuable. The war becomes harsher, more expensive, more desperate. No one publicly wants this path. But every false reading of temporary calm as real resolution makes it more likely. The third path is the long ceasefire path. No grand peace, no clean treaty, no iconic ending, just a prolonged freeze that slowly hardens into reality because the alternatives are too costly. Oil matters too much. China keeps enough diplomatic oxygen in the room, and nobody wants to admit the conflict is not truly solved so much as part. This may be the outcome Beijing prefers most because it keeps Iran alive. It keeps Hormuz usable enough for Chinese needs. It denies Washington a clean victory, and it leaves behind a strategic lesson that other states will study very carefully. Even at the world's most important maritime choke point, American pressure by itself was not enough to dictate the final usable outcome. That is the larger question of this war. Not simply who wins a battle, but whether America can still convert overwhelming force into uncontested political meaning when another great power has quietly spent years making sure the target state can keep breathing. That is why I think the public conversation is still one full layer too shallow. People keep asking whether Iran blinked. That is the wrong question. The better question is whether this war has already revealed something. America is trying to solve what is effectively a three-player game while publicly speaking as if only two players matter. That is the analytical error. If the real structure is America, Iran, and China, then any strategy that treats China as a passive observer instead of the hidden architect of Iranian endurance will misread both the bargaining and the battlefield. This is not prophecy. It is structure. It is incentive. It is the logical result of a decade spent building around sanctions, around dollar power, around maritime vulnerability, and around the possibility that one day Washington would try to decide the meaning of Hormuz by force. That is why the ending of this war is becoming easier to see. America can dominate the opening phase. It can punish, it can degrade, it can strike. What it cannot do at a price its own system is willing to bear is turn that superiority into a clean political ending on its own terms. And when an empire reaches that point, the ending may take time, but the direction is already set. That is the real story here. Not simply war. Not simply Iran, but the visible beginning of an American retreat from a region it can still damage, but no longer shaped by itself.